have this application called uHaiku, where users can write up a haiku and add it to the site. Now there are many haikus which have already been added, and I would like users to be able to vote for them, either giving them a thumbs up or a thumbs down. Now there's currently no voting system in place yet, so how could I add this feature? Well, you can certainly do this from scratch, but here I'll be using this gem, the Active Record Reputation System. This allows you to easily calculate an average user rating, or sum up the number of votes, and more. So let me show you how to get it working in this application. I'll start by adding this gem to the bottom of my gem file called Active Record-reputation-system. And you'll need to also require the file separately. It's called reputation_system. And as usual, run the bundle command to install the gem. And next you'll need to run this generator called reputation_system. So this generates a few migration files, which I'll take a look at later, but for now, let's just migrate the database. Next, I'll go into the model I want to be able to vote on, which is the haiku model, and I can add a colon here to has reputation, and then pass in the name I want to give the reputation. In this case, I'll call it votes. And then I need to pass in a couple more options. A source, which I'll set to user, and that's the model that will be doing the voting, and then I need to pass in an aggregated by option, and set that to either sum or average or product, depending on how you want the calculation to happen. Now these options are all documented in the README, and there are some other ones that you can pass in as well. So with that in place, I can now work on my voting system. I just want a couple links here to vote a haiku up or down, but the question is, where should these links route to? So inside of the routes file, we have a couple of options. We could make a separate haiku votes resource, or we could just make this a member action on the haiku resource. So I'm going to do that here, so I'll just make this a post request to a vote action on the haiku's controller. So this means inside of my haiku's controller I have prepared, I need to define a vote action, and the value of this should be either +1 or -1 depending on the type of vote. So I'm going to have a type parameter and check if this is up, and if so, then we're going to be +1. Otherwise, we'll do -1. And then I can fetch the haiku just like I am up here. Next, I can use a method provided by the reputation system called addEvaluation, and this takes 3 arguments. The first one is the name of the reputation, which is votes, and then the next one is the value to do, so that's going to be the value variable we set earlier, and the third one is the source object, which in this case is going to be the current user object. And then finally, I'll just redirect to back, which is the refer, and let's say a notice saying thank you for voting. Now I just need to add some links to do the voting. So this is the view template for displaying a haiku, and I'm going to first make a new link here for doing an upvote, and that'll go to the vote haiku path, and I'll pass in the haiku object and also a type attribute. I'll set that to up, and then I'll set the method to a post. And I'll do the same thing for the down vote as well. Now you may need to restart your Rails app after adding the gem and then reloading the page. There are the up and down links, which we can click on up to vote that given haiku up. Now if you want to click the link again, let's see what happens. It says record is invalid because that given source has already been taken, which is that given user. So the reputation system automatically prevents duplicate votes. So we could either rescue from that exception in this controller action, or we could use a different method called add or update evaluation. So this will change the user's existing vote. So now if a user does vote again, it will just change their existing vote instead of raising an error. Now it would be nice if we could see how many votes a haiku received, so let's do that. We can do that by calling a method on the haiku object, reputation value 4, and we want the votes reputation, and this will return a float of the calculated results. So I'm going to turn that into an integer, and I also want to pluralize this so that it will show up nice and pretty. So reloading this page, that shows it has -1 votes. We can upvote this one, and now that one has 1 vote. So now the question is, how would we sort these based on how many votes they have? I'm going to do this inside of the haiku's controller index action, where I'm currently just fetching all the haikus. There's a method provided called find with reputation, and then the first argument is the name of the reputation, which is going to be votes. And the second argument is the scope you want to use. Now I haven't talked about reputation scopes yet. This isn't an active record name scope. This is something specific for the reputation system. You can check out the README for details, but here I'm just going to use the all scope so it finds everything. And then the third argument are any additional find options. I'm going to say to order by the calculated votes result, in descending order. And then watch this first haiku as I reload this page, and that goes down to the bottom of the page because it has -1 votes. Now what if I want to calculate the total votes a user has received for all their haikus and display that next to their name? Well, the reputation system allows us to define reputations sort of indirectly, so here's how we might do this inside of the user model. I'm going to call hasReputation in here and also call this votes, but for the source I'm going to use a hash, so this will instruct it to delegate to the reputation called votes on the haiku model. So this will go through the user's haikus association, and let's also have this aggregated by the sum value. And then I can use this where I display the user's name, which is inside of my application layout file. So next to this, I want to display the number of votes in parentheses for the current user, and I can call reputation value for the votes reputation just like I did in the haiku template. So I'm going to convert this to an integer as well. So reloading this page, there's the number of votes I have, which is 0 because the two I have cancels each other out. And if I upvote 1, then the number of votes changes to 1. Now what if I want some way to determine if a user has already voted for a given haiku and maybe hide these vote links if they have? Well, I couldn't find a good way to do this within the gem itself, but it's still possible. It just requires a little better understanding of how the reputation system works. Well, if you take a look at one of the migration files that we generated earlier, you can see that this gem creates a table called RS evaluations, and a record is inserted in here when the user votes. So this keeps track of the reputation name, which is votes, the source, which is going to be the user model, and the target, which is going to be the haiku model, and notice that these are both polymorphic associations. And then finally the value, which is either +1 or -1. Now there is an RS evaluation model that goes along with that table, so this means that we can associate our user record to that model. To do this, we could say maybe has many evaluations, and we can set the class name to RS evaluation, and we want to say as source because it is a polymorphic association. So with this in place, we can determine if a given user model has voted for a given haiku. So we can fetch all the evaluations and determine if there's one where the target type is the haiku class and the target ID is the haiku's ID. So let's just see if that object is present, and there are more efficient ways to do this if you're doing it a lot on one page, but I'll just leave it at like this for now. Now with that method, we can hide these up and down links if the user has already voted. So here's what it might look like. If we have a current user, and that current user has already voted, so voted for that given haiku, and actually if they have not already voted for that haiku, then we want to display those up and down links like this. And now when I reload the page, those voting links are now gone on the haikus I voted for, so that's how you can change the behavior depending on what the user has voted on. Now there's probably more that you'd want to do to this application, such as adding this restriction to the controller action, and also preventing a user from voting on his own haikus, but I'll leave that as an exercise. Well, that's it for this quick tour on the Active Record Reputation System. Now this is a handy gem, but I kept asking myself while working on this episode, how difficult would this be to do the same thing from scratch? So I decided to try it out, and as a bonus in the source code of this episode, I'll include this from scratch version so you can check it out in full detail on your own, but let me walk you through it really quickly. Basically, I made this haiku vote model which belongs to both a haiku and a user, and what I like about this is I can put a lot of custom validation specifically about my application in this vote model, including what type of vote values I want to accept and whether or not the user that is voting is the author of the haiku. Probably the most difficult thing to do from scratch is sorting the haikus based on the number of votes, and you can find this behavior inside of the haiku by votes method. You can see it takes some gnarly SQL code to get this functionality working, but it works. Now another tricky area is determining the total number of votes for a given user, but this really isn't too bad with Active Record's join functionality and the sum method. So the big question is, should you write this from scratch or use the gem? Well, I think the reputation system gem is really useful if you have a more complicated setup, especially if you have multiple models that you're handling the reputation on, as polymorphic associations can really help with that. But if you have a more simple setup, like the example application I have in this episode, then writing from scratch I think is a good option. That's all for this episode. Thanks for watching. In this week's Pro episode, I go in depth into the thread safe config option, which will likely be enabled by default in Rails 4. There I break down what that option does, how to handle multiple threads in production, and some tips on writing thread safe code. To watch that episode and gain access to all previous Pro and revised episodes, visit railscast.com/pro, and you can sign up there for just $9 per month. I have often been asked how to export Excel or CSV data through Rails. Well, that's what I want to tackle in this episode. Here I have a list of products, and I would like some download links at the top here to download either a CSV or Excel file. Now, there are many gems that help do this, but I won't be using any of those here. It's pretty easy just to do it yourself. Now, there's an excellent CSV library that comes with Ruby 1.9. It was formerly known as Faster CSV in Ruby 1.8. Here I'll be using this library to generate the CSV data. Since this is part of the standard library, all we have to do is require it. I'll be doing that at the top of my application config file. I'll just add a line in here to require CSV. Now I can use that to generate comma-separated data when a .csv extension is used in the URL. Now currently this doesn't work because it doesn't respond to that format yet. That's easy enough to remedy by going to my products controller index action, which is the page that was being displayed, and then add a respond to block here to handle the HTML format and the CSV format. Now from here I have a couple of choices. One option is to generate a new view template for the specific format, or I could just keep it all within Ruby and render it inline here. I'm going to go with the latter option because I've tried both approaches and find this approach a little simpler. So I could call render text and then generate the CSV content here. Now I'm actually going to do that inside of the model because I'm going to create a new method called toCSV, which parallels nicely with toXML or toJSON methods that Rails provides. And then going into the product model, I can define that class method called toCSV, and I can use the CSV library here to generate some comma-separated data. So this is how you do it, and you can just append an array of values to the CSV object, which is passed into this block. So this first line will just be a header row, and I'll set this to column names just to do all the columns, but you might want to be more specific and only add certain columns into here. And then I can loop through all the products, so that's all.each, and then for each of the products, I want to insert a row into the CSV, and I'm going to use the product attributes, but only the values which are matching the column name. So this way we make sure that they're in the proper order. Now you may need to restart your Rails application to pick up the CSV library, but once you do and reload the page, there's all of our comma-separated data for the products. It works. Now if you want this content to be downloaded instead of rendered inline in the browser, you can use send data instead of render text in the controller. So now when I reload this page, it'll download that content as a file. So now what about an Excel file? Well, they could just import the CSV file straight into Excel, but it might be nice to have an actual XLS file that the user could double-click to open. To do that, we'll need to add a new MIME type, and we can do so under the config initializers directory under mimetypes.rb. So in here, I'll just register a new MIME type, .register, and then it's called application/XLS, and that'll be the XLS extension. And then back in the controller, I can have this respond to the XLS format. However, it can't be simple comma-separated data. It needs to be tab-separated for it to open up properly in Excel. Now, fortunately, the CSV library supports a column separator option, which you can pass in just passing in a tab character in there. So this means in the product model, I need to change this toCSV method to accept a hash of options, which I then get passed into that generate call in the CSV library. So now let's try passing in that XLS extension, and this will download an Excel-specific file, so let's try opening it. And for the most part, this works fine. It opens up without any problem, and the columns are separated correctly. However, there are a couple of issues. For example, the degree symbol here in this one product name doesn't look correct. It's not encoded properly. Now, there are some workarounds to this issue, but there are other problems with this approach as well, such as columns cannot contain new lines. Now, instead of doing this approach, I'm going to actually use a template for the XLS version. So under the Views Products directory, I'll make a new file here called index.xls.erb. Now I'm just going to paste in an HTML table into here containing the data I want to export, because Excel has no problem opening and displaying HTML tables. Let's try this again. Download an XLS version and open it up. And that opens up fine. And you can see that degree symbol looks correct and new lines would have no problem in the columns as well. However, it does look a little bit different because the HTML formatting is just adding a border around this table area, and the header looks different as well. But you can customize the formatting within the HTML document, and that will be reflected here as well. Now, if you want to generate a file that feels a little more like a native Excel document, you can do something like this. This is some XML that Excel understands, and what's neat about this is you can customize different worksheets, and you can format each column to a different type. And I'll try downloading this version and opening it up in Excel as well. Now in OS X, this does bring up a warning dialog, making sure I'm okay with opening it, I guess because this format could contain something dangerous, so I'll say open. And there we go. This looks nice, and it doesn't have any encoding problems, and really feels like a true Excel document. Now the best source of documentation I found for that format is this XML spreadsheet reference. I'll link to this in the show notes. Basically, it gives you some documentation on each of the various tags which could be in that XML document. And another option is to reverse engineer this code. You could just save an Excel document as an XML file and then check that out in a text editor. There's one more thing left to do to finish up this episode, and that is add a couple of links to this page to download those two formats. So inside of my index.html template, I'll just paste in the code for this to add those two links. And reloading the page, there are those links, and clicking on one will just download that specific format. It works. Well, that's all I have for this episode. Thanks for watching. In the Pro episode this week, I continue off of last week's episodes and show you how to integrate Facebook further into your application using the Open Graph protocol. To watch that episode and gain access to all previous Pro and revised episodes, visit railscast.com/pro, and you can sign up there for just $9 per month.